Go.
All right, welcome everyone to part 3 of Alain Badiou's Being an Event. And of course this is where he lays out one of the final concepts in the deployment of pure being as such. And the concept being deployed here is infinity. And he is going to go over the possibilities of infinity, what it means. But to begin with, he has to differentiate his subtractive philosophy from the previous phenomenological projects. And the way in which he does this is by the question of nature as a math theme or as a poem. And so he goes into great detail about how previous phenomenologists, and to a certain extent the general history of philosophy, excluding a few figures like Plato, and then later the radical rupture with Descartes, and which he terms the Galilean event, I believe. How most of philosophy has, actually I'm going to use this term, idealized the poem. And of course the figure that he takes most clearly to task is Heidegger, but of course we can see this throughout, you know, from what is misunderstood about the Parmenidean poem, to Nietzsche's aestheticism, to modern day phenomenology and postmodernism, which has an obscene fixation on poetry. So that's sort of the project of this first section, and so let's get going through it. For those of you who don't know, there's 3 main concepts that are from Heidegger that are applied here. One is physis, and for those of you who don't know Greek, it's the one with the little U and the line through it, also known as phi. So that's physis, which roughly translates to nature. However, you should be extraordinarily careful with this, because Heidegger makes a distinction between the Greek physis and the Latin, what is it?
Natura.
Natura, yeah, which is our nature. And of course, we'll get more into that. So physis can roughly be understood as nature, but have an extreme care in regards to it. It is not the mathematized Galilean nature, right, that we think of when we think of physics today. So physis, we also have the term techne. Techne means a work of art, or an art. So often we think of techne like technology. It's important to note this distinction. It's often translated as a skill. Craft. But what's important to remember is Heidegger is returning to this sort of originary point, and so it's the act, the work of art, which reveals physis, right, in its own standing to itself, in self-becoming, and other fun Heideggerian nonsense like that. And then finally, which is actually only touched on, is, well, it's only directly touched on briefly, which is aletheia. And of course, the easy understanding of aletheia is truth, but this is a brutal truncation of the term and the concept. Lethe being forgetfulness, after the river Lethe. Aletheia is to unforget, to unveil, to enter into non-forgetfulness, which Heidegger will go through is right. The physis of the idios reveals itself, is the aletheia of itself in its own most, that which stands in itself. So with these concepts, we're gonna if you have additional questions as we go through, we can deal with that, but we're gonna just start in. So for example, nature, we have 123, he specifically says, physis is what appears in itself and also appears as a gift. So nature also appears as a presentation. The important thing is nature is what stands in itself and is revealed in itself, which means it's not generated out of us. It's not a structure as such, right? It's not an ontological math theme structure. For example, with subtractive philosophy, there is a deductive characteristic, right? A hypothetical characteristic, for example, the decisions on the axioms. Phusis is not like that, right? Phusis is the thing that shows itself in its own most. So out of its very, if you'll pardon the term, nature, it can't be something humanly generated, right? It's a gift of nature. It's something that is, to a certain extent, appears as a radical rupture upon us, which under Heidegger is later going to come to be ontology, right? The being of itself, which is not something we generate, right? I mean, this is why Heidegger focuses so heavily not on the human being, not on the subject qua subject, but on the Dasein, right? The being there. It is this originary condition for all experience, which is not contingent on us, right? We don't decide our being in the world, our being for others, but rather that's the gift that is the very condition for our existence. And we'll see how this is fundamentally different from subtractive politics a little bit later. So under Galileo, nature becomes a mathematized physics or nature, and so the idea, which originally stood as self-evident opening of nature, then simply becomes the collation of appearance under a conceptual apparatus, right? And we can see this very clearly in Heidegger as the instrumental reason, right? Where we no longer have this radical rupture and opening of being in itself, but simply the passing over of being and the turning of being or existence or concepts or the world or phusis of nature into an object to be used for us. And in the more specific Galilean sense, the instrument, just as my phone becomes an instrument for me to use to call, right, the mathematical instrument is the core of science. Hence Heidegger's famous quote, science doesn't think, right, because it's just an instrument which glosses over nature. So under Heidegger, as I was saying, the idea, not under Heidegger himself, but Heidegger's conception of science and the mathematization, the idea loses its relation to nature and becomes covered over. This leads to the ultimate obscuring of truth, and the idea, instead of being the appearance, the self-evidence of phusis, instead becomes a cut, in a mathematical cut in nature, right? What the idea as he would say in the Platonic sense, has been obscured into just a simple object to be used. So, in this case, we have that the math theme is separate, and this is again 129 to 125 to 126. The math theme is separate from the pre-Platonic form. So in the pre-Platonic form, it depends on the work of art or techne. However, Badiou rejects the poetical natural disposition because, again, there was plenty of art and poetry beforehand. So, to a certain extent, what Badiou is just going through the actual history of philosophy, which is if one reads Confucius or Lao Tzu or any of the Vedics or the, I mean, you can take your pick, right? There's constant talk of nothing, of being in itself. And so Badiou rejects this as a failure to account for these other elements, right? Heidegger, of course, attempts to account for them in a certain way in which the Greeks were the primary inheritors of the Aryans. A little bit Nazi-rific about that sort of conception of, right, the Western race as originating out of this. But I mean, if we actually examine the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the Indians didn't necessarily have that strong connection. So Badiou wants to ask, well then what is it that made the Greeks home of modern Western philosophy, if not this question of being, or if not this poesis? And of course, the answer is, well, just briefly, what he says is that the Greeks basically interrupted poetry. And the way in which they interrupted poetry is through mathematization, right? The introduction of the mathematical form into the poetic as such. Now, he just says this, he states this as though it's self-evident, but if you look at the actual works, one of the things that distinguishes Greek forms is a regularity, right? A regularity, a mathematical regularity of both form, of syllable, and of emphasis.